Just before we start, we all know that there's a problem in academia with people not getting paid for the work they're doing, particularly younger scholars. We at the project want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. So we need your help to do that. If you can afford to donate £1 a month to support this project and keep it free forever, please go to our Patreon page at patreon.com/projectrs and sign up there. If you want to make a one-off donation, you can do that too through our PayPal button on the homepage. But together we can help to change the culture of exploitation in academia. That's patreon.com/projectrs. Now here's the episode.
Roll up, listeners. It's Monday. It's Religious Studies Project time. We are coming to you not live, but pre-recorded from the Wash Bar in Edinburgh. My name is Christopher Cotter, and I'm joined as ever
by David Robertson, and I'm also this week's interviewer.
Yes.
This is a recording quite recently. I think it was only 3 weeks ago at the Open University's Contemporary Religion in Historical Perspective conference, organised by myself. And it's a conversation with Richard Irvine and Theodoros Kyriakides, who are working on a research project at the Open University, which is part of the bigger Understanding Unbelief project. But here we talk about magical thinking in the modern world. So I will pass straight over and explain more to you there. I'm joining you again from Milton Keynes, where I'm at the Contemporary Religion in Historical Perspective conference. And today I'm joined by Richard Irvine and Theo Kyriakides, who have a project called Magical Thinking in Context and Situation of Unbelief, which is part of the bigger Understanding Unbelief project. Today they're going to be talking about magical thinking in contemporary modern society, with quote marks on it. So welcome to the project.
Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So Richard, perhaps you could tell us about the project that you're working on.
I mean, the basic set of questions we're asking, it comes out of reflections on secularization thesis. The general idea being that as societies become more apparently rationalized, more secularized, as you see, fewer people directly affiliating with religious groups, surely the follow-on from this would be that there's less space in society for practices that we might term magic, for thinking about the world as an enchanted place. But in actual fact, what we see in our different field sites is that even with people who would define themselves as non-believers, who would see themselves as outside of religious structures and indeed rejecting forms of belief, there still seems to be this place in their life for reflecting on what is unknowable and trying to engage with it in different ways. And so really what we want to do is say that rather than secularization squeezing magic out of contemporary life, out of modern life, that in fact secularization seems to open up new spaces that magic can grow within.
Yeah, just to add that if you take the notion of modernity, it was Max Weber who kind of predicted the disenchantment of modernity. It was kind of like it was a prophecy that was done. When did he say that? 1920s.
Yeah, I mean, so he's speaking in Science and Vocation. That's just after the First World War. So.
Yeah. So obviously he's taking some criticism, but to an extent, I guess somebody can make the argument that modernity is disenchanted with magic.
Yeah.
So that's our starting point to see to what extent disenchantment can allow for magical phenomena to manifest.
Because I mean, what I was talking about this morning with Science and Vocation, why I mentioned that is in that lecture, what Weber does is he says, I mean, he's addressing this to students who obviously they think they're very smart, And he's saying, well, you think you're smart? How much do you actually know? Because if you think about natives in tribes elsewhere in the world, they have a great store of their knowledge. And so he says, you board a streetcar, you don't know how it propels itself unless you're a physicist. You buy things without really any notion of why sometimes you can get less or more for the money. Whereas in many societies, in fact, people have an understanding of where their food comes from. They have an understanding of what. So you're saying, in fact, in modern, technologically advanced, specialized societies, there's actually far less of a portion of the total knowledge that we have. And so in that, he's saying, yes, we are becoming more rationalized. But does that necessarily mean that we are entering a state of more knowing? So in a sense, the secularization thesis, as Weber sets it up, I think allows for this space of enchantment rather than disenchantment, because what you have there is that whole space of unknowing about everything that isn't your very particular job within the division of labour.
But there was another model of modernity, which actually might be slightly earlier, but was certainly in currency around the same time. The whole James Frazer model, in which modernity, building on evolutionary models and Darwinism, social Darwinism, basically, of that we moved from superstition and magic to religion to science. And so that modernity was, as you said, it was a prediction, but it was a prediction in that model which does replace kind of magical thinking completely. So Weber's model of modernity is definitely not the only version of it that's going around at the same time.
Yeah, what's interesting about Frazer's work is that it perseveres. He's taken so much critique for being, a culture evolutionist or a primitivist, because he presents this linear trajectory which societies have to be followed in order to be legitimized as modern, right? So he's kind of, I think anthropologists have the knee-jerk reaction of kind of denouncing an evolutionary model. But at the same time, he's a well-known, people talk about him. People who are not anthropologists know about Frazer's work. And in an ironic twist, the trajectory that he kind of presented as evolutionary, that work, that corpus of work, kind of substantiates magical belief in modernity as well. People read, in my opinion, the way that magical traditions kind of become reiterated in modernity has to do through Frazer's work in a way.
So would you say when people are buying and reading The Golden Bough, because you can still get it in those editions that are like £2 or something. So when people are like, are they looking for magic rather than instead? I mean, what is it they're looking for in there, and is it that disenchanted? I suppose.
Yeah, I think the book has a certain allure. Like I don't think what people are going to read, but the fact that take the back cover has to do with magic, or let's see.
Well, it's very readable. It's very accessible, even to non-academics. It does that sweeping, grand theory that and it boils down to quite simple. There's one kind of central narrative.
And he was a tremendous publicist. I think contemporary academics could learn a lot from him, getting their ideas into the mass marketplace.
Now, actually, you could make the argument that Frazer's work is a form of magical thinking in itself, in that he connects all these disparate elements and links them together into a grand narrative. It's that sort of synthetic knowledge that we see in a lot of schools of occultism, for instance. But when you guys are talking about, magical thinking in these kind of terms, break down how you're using that for us. You already mentioned kind of ideas of the ineffable earlier on. I don't think you used the term ineffable, but you said something similar. But there's also kind of practical aspects as well. So break down how you're using ideas of magic.
So I think the way we kind of use the term magical thinking, it doesn't necessarily have to do with people subscribing to existing magical traditions or practices. It also has to do with the way by which they kind of develop their own worldviews and philosophies that have the underlying assumption of magical efficacy. So magical efficacy can be, it can adopt characteristics of contagious efficacy or automatic efficacy. What Frazer called sympathetic and contagious magic. So yeah, once again, it's not necessarily the people following explicit magical traditions, but also developing their own ways of understanding and dwelling in the world, which can adopt those characteristics that anthropologists associate with magical traditions in a more implicit manner.
I mean, one of the things we talked about in terms of how we were defining magic in the project, and you can shoot this down if you think I'm being too specific about it, but I think it's important to think about, especially in what we're talking about as a modern context, it's important to think about individual practices that people adopt in order to make sense, in order to make sense of the world around them, in order to in certain ways gain some kind of mode of control over the world around them. So I think that emphasis that is classic in most anthropological theory, that what we're talking about here are certainly social practices which exist within a social space, but which are the domain of individuals, individual action, rather than necessarily religious ritual, which brings social groups together. But I think that that's quite important in a way for talking about the modern world, because in fact, as has been repeatedly pointed out, we're seeing more and more individualization, more and more fragmentation in how people, the whole designation of people talking about themselves as spiritual but not religious, these kind of things. It's often about that idea that people are being more idiosyncratic, more personal in how they in how they engage with the world and what is potentially unknowable. But I mean, the kind of things, I think something I mentioned this morning, which I think is a really interesting case in point because it's a contested one, but recently Sally LePage launching an attack on water companies in the UK for in her practicing magic, because she says, she contacted these water companies and they said, well, yes, we're divining, we're going out with dowsing rods. Some people who work for us are going out with divining rods, and they're looking for water, and that's part of the battery of things that are used here. Now, what's interesting there is immediately she leaps to this idea that this is magic, because it's something which doesn't necessarily fit with our hypothetical deductive model of science. So to be Frazer, this is the thing which we should have been left behind once we worked out proper scientific ways of finding water. But in fact, when I talk to people in Orkney, some of whom do rely on divining in order to find where to bore for water, but this works. There's a practical knowledge that people have of the landscape and where to find water. So they're not necessarily, and I think this is an important point, they're not necessarily thinking of it or describing it as magic, but certainly they would reject the idea that simply because something doesn't fit with what is tested and known according to parameters of science, they're not going to reject it just because of that. They're not going to say, "Oh, it doesn't fit with the peer-reviewed literature. Well, I'm not going to divine for water anymore." In fact, it's like this is practical knowledge of the landscape, and that's what they go with.
It seems to me, though, that you've got two different ideas of magic in play there, and I think this is common across the board. So it's not meant as a criticism of you, but rather for the listener in terms of how we are using the term discursively. So on the one hand, you said that it was something that wasn't part of a recognized religious tradition, but it wasn't about religious communities, but it was used by the individual. But then we shifted to talking about it as something which wasn't, that was a practice that was thought of as having efficacy, but not through appeals to science. So those are two quite different things, are they not?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, the one of the reasons that the project is interesting to me as well is that people kind of have lost touch of what magic is. Because if you go to initial ethnographic studies, like magic is not just a belief in the supernatural or a belief in, gods or spiritual beings. Magic is also like a system of practices which have actual ways of reproducing societal structures and kinship. And I think, as Richard said, like modernity kind of led to the fragmentation of the individual, and in a way, it kind of led to the fragmentation of magic as well. So we can talk about this later as well. That magic, in my field side, has a certain polysemy. Like people understand what magic is in different ways. So to use Richard's language from this morning today, there's a certain archaeology of magic. There was magic, and it's been like now it's kind of hidden under layers of modernity, layers of science, and so in a way we're kind of conducting an archaeology of how people relocate this sort of like traces of magical thinking in the everyday.
I mean, and in terms of whether or not, I mean, this is always going to be kind of the problem, both methodological and theoretically, because when you're talking about something like magic, you're talking about something which is simultaneously being the locus of thousands and thousands of papers of theorization, and also something which is in the popular imagination. I think Graham Jones in his which you've read quite a lot, Theo, a bit and been working with, but Graham Jones in his recent book. On what's the title of the
Magic's Reason?
Magic's Reason. I mean, that's very interesting because Graham Jones did his PhD with what I suppose a lot of people would associate with magic. He did his PhD on stage magic, but he's gone through this on the archaeology. It's used what you're using. He's gone through this to look at what does this idea of magic and performance say about the longer strands of magic that are available in European and American culture, rather than this being a different thing. So the basic problem here is that we are talking about something which is everyday language and can't necessarily be labeled purely from the point of view of sociological or other theories, which is so much the case, I think, in religious studies, because we don't have ownership. We don't have ownership over these words, and you can't necessarily say. So sometimes that does mean that you're involved in shifting, So with the Sally LePage example, what's interesting is she's using magic in that particular way. She's using magic in, we would say, the Frazerian way of this is what society should have evolved beyond.
It's backwards,
Yeah. Now, when you have people who are simultaneously saying, "I'm an unbeliever. I've gone beyond. I don't hold with religion. I don't hold with people telling me what to believe." Now, from a Frazerian point of view, right, they've stepped into the next level. They're beyond religion. But what's curious there, from the point of view of these conflicting views of magic, is, but hang on, they've stepped into that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have left behind. In fact, what it means is that they're rejecting religious authority structures, but they may also reject authority structures which are rationalist authority structures. So there's and in that context, then the idea, so you've got this conflict of an idea of magic as a failed form of science, which is one model, coming into conflict with the idea of magic as a practical way of engaging with a world which is full of unknowable things. And it's full of unknowable because of the nature of a society where it's so specialized, to go back to this point, it's so specialized that we know less and less about the whole store of knowledge because we only really have proper understanding of the tiny bit of the division of labor that we've got, if even that.
Personally, I don't use the word magic when I do fieldwork a lot. So I'm not going to ask people, do you believe or practice magic? Because as Richard said, it kind of ended up being a signifier of irrationality and backwardness. So I might use the word Maya, which is like the local term in the Cypriot dialect for magic. But what's interesting is like once something is labeled as magic, is labeled as irrational. They're kind of excluded from the normative order of things.
Mhm.
But at the same time, to take the dowsing example, it is something that people did without questioning. Like the fact that they went around, maybe they were questioning in their heads, but the fact that this practice was being reproduced is interesting. The fact that we're going around divining for water, and that this was a practice that had, attributes of magical thinking, but which was nevertheless naturalized into the normative order of things.
I mean, just in a conversation we were having earlier with one of the other participants at the conference, which I think is a very good, it struck me as a great example of magical thinking. We were talking about how there's lots of debates about in court, when you make your oath, what of an unbeliever? Should an unbeliever be allowed to, and this is contested in many places, should an unbeliever be allowed to not make an oath on the Bible? How do they make an oath? But what's interesting in a lot of these debates is not it focuses on whether the Bible should be there or not, but the actual question of the oath isn't necessarily called into question. That somehow that performative act of making an oath has a transformative effect on the truthful quality of the entire thing. Now, it's quite striking that that's still something which is at the heart of it's at the heart of our legacy. It's at the heart of our ideas of what constitutes the rule of law. Now, ultimately, these are ideas of magical thinking, which I think in some respects do go unexamined. And I mean, our task is certainly I don't see our task as being to in some way debunk these or to suggest, but rather to give lie to the idea that a modern, secularized, rationalized, you can add in all kinds of words to this, leaves these things behind. I mean, it's sort of, I suppose I've come right back to killing the ghost of Frazer again, but that wasn't my intention when I started this sentence.
That's okay. He's already dead. So
Just to go back to something Theo was saying there, I mean, a couple of times recently I've been thinking about, and this came up during my fieldwork in conspiracy and UFO communities, is the idea of sometimes these things are in the subjunctive mode. Okay, so they're, and I think this is particularly pertinent when we talk about things like dowsing, but also alternative therapies. One thing I found was that there was almost always, there was very common for people to get into New Age or UFO or conspiracy communities through alternative healthcare, essentially because they had chronic illness of one type or another. And so when the scientific mainstream treatments didn't work, they were prepared to try anything. So they would try them in the subjunctive mode to see if they work. And then when one of them works for whatever reason, that then is a confirmation that, some of these things do work, even though science says it's not true. And this leads them to then embrace a number of other possible things in the subjunctive mode. And I think that dowsing is like that. The council is probably thinking, well, I don't know if it works or not, but it might work. If it has given us results, then fine. I'm not going to think too much about, whether it's scientific or not. And you find the same thing in like acupuncture treatment in the NHS. They're prepared to pay for acupuncture or like sometimes aromatherapy and things. And they're like, well, it doesn't matter if it's only working because it's a placebo. If it's working, it's working.
So subjectivity kind of demands maintaining a certain propensity to the potential, to something that you don't, to the unknowable.
Yeah, the rational justification for it is secondary to the practical applications and the function.
Yeah, there's this famous phrase I like from Jean Fabre-Sade's work. I know that jokes are that magic is a joke, but still, is that tension that the unbeliever kind of oscillates with, that kind of magical thinking emerges from. I know that magic is a joke or it doesn't exist, but still. And she borrows this from psychoanalyst Octave Manoni, who kind of deals with subjectivity and in terms of magical thinking as well. So that was, I think that was like a phrase that was kind of foundational in the theoretical questions that we tackle.
I mean, I think the magic eye is a very good example. I mean, because the way that you've talked about the the way you talked about the evil eye, it's a good example of that, because you talk about the way that in certain modes this can be used seriously.
So the evil eye in Cyprus, on certain occasions, it can be used as decoration on people's shoes or T-shirts or earrings or houses in general. But under certain occasions, it is granted a much more magical quality by the people using it. So under occasions of uncertainty or stress, or even in the everyday, I talk to people and they tell me I don't really believe in the evil eye. I don't acknowledge that it's in my house. But sometimes when I'm having a bad day, if I'm having bad thoughts, I might just think about it. I might look at it. And
which I think goes back to what you were saying. It's that I know this is a joke, but still, I mean that I think there's a certain sense of what unbelief would involve, which should end after the first part of that. I know it's a joke, full stop.
Yeah.
But that's not what we see in the messiness of everyday life. It's I know, but that doesn't mean in the subjective mode. That doesn't mean that there are not other. In the subjunctive mode, there may be other contexts in which I might want this to or I at least cannot be sure that there's not. So it's better to do it just in case.
I don't know if you're familiar with Martin Stringer's work, but he talks about this
came
kind
up
of
in the discussion today.
Situational belief, and exactly the same sort of idea where. And this actually relates to the sort of subjunctive, the example I gave before, if you asked this person, do you believe in the chi flowing around the body, or they'd say no. But when it came down to, if I try this, it might, I might be able to put that aside for long enough that it works. Or, people don't tend to believe in prophecy or speaking to the dead, but if their husband or loved one has just died, they might have an overwhelming desire to speak to them, and in which case they enter a different mode of expressing belief.
I mean, I was saying this in the discussion earlier. One of the things I find interesting about Stringer's work is that you have particularly this situation that he discusses in relation to the dead and practices to do with communication with the dead and things, even among people who would not necessarily see themselves as believers. And that's very interesting in the context of, and one of the reasons why I chose Orkney to do this fieldwork, is that you have a landscape here which is very much archaeologically defined by the presence of these Neolithic tombs, that it's recognized as being a landscape of the dead. And indeed, for many people, the cemeteries, even though the kirks themselves may have been made into private houses or just falling down, the cemeteries retain that kind of space. And that to me is something that's quite interesting, because in essence, you can have a personal stance in relation to, I don't believe that it is possible to communicate with the dead, for example. You can have that as a personal stance, but you're still living in a landscape where reminders of the dead are all around you. And how, I think one of the issues at stake here is, how do you simultaneously engage with personal stance, which says this is all, I know this is all nonsense, say, and also a recognition that there is an entire world which is around you, which is built on the idea that there is some continuity of the dead, that there is some possibility, that there is a continuing involvement of the dead in social life. And part of what is interesting then, in terms of the practices that people adopt, is how they might find a way of dealing with that unknowability of the landscape which surrounds them. So I think the idea, we were talking about this earlier, so the idea that you can adopt this stance in relation to objects which is not purely materialistic, or in relation to a landscape which is not purely materialistic, doesn't seem to be that is completely incompatible with people nevertheless expressing their personal set of beliefs as materialistic set of beliefs. So it's it's a stance in relation to these things.
One of the things I like, and we're getting close to time, but one of the things I like most about your project is the two case studies that you're comparing in Orkney and Cyprus, and on, at first glance, quite different. One of them's familiar to me, one of them's completely alien. Tell me a little bit about how you see these two case studies working together. What are the potential kind of tensions and possible similarities that you see there that you can tease out in the comparison?
Well, they're both islands. Let's start. We can start with that.
I think the two veins that we identified thus far is, do you want to talk about anti-authoritarianism?
Yeah, okay.
Unknowability?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we weren't aware of this. I mean, this is part of anthropology and ethnography in general. You don't necessarily know what's going to happen until you go into the field. There is a Kierkegaardian leap of faith in anthropology, and so it was only really once we started comparing notes that we realized that one of the things which was quite central in both of these cases was that people who spoke about themselves as unbelievers were doing so as an anti-authoritarian stance, that this was a way of saying, a way of saying that people shouldn't be allowed to define what you believe in, that people shouldn't tell you what to think as though you don't ken yourself. And that was very striking in the Orkanian example, that most people spoke about the idea that, in essence, religion was part of a power structure, which was a power structure associated with those who are property owners, that it was associated with, that it was something that they didn't feel they should be subject to. And that, which has very long lines in histories of dissent in the Church of Scotland too, which reject that idea of patronage in the church, by the by. But it was interesting then when I started comparing notes with Theo that we realised actually, especially among, and correct me if I'm wrong, especially among many of the young people who would describe themselves as atheists or non-believers, it was that sense of an anti-clericalism, an anti-authoritarian stance.
Sort of a knee-jerk reaction against dogmatic depictions of religion in Cyprus. In Cyprus, like the rise of the republic kind of parallels to the rise of the Cypriot church. Our first president was a clergyman, and so on. So it's a church and state kind of dovetailed together, and I think that ended up in this gesture of kind of distancing yourself from religious authority.
But just to segue into you talking about unknowability, one of the crucial things then, if you've identified that when we're talking about unbelief, we're not necessarily talking about an idea of rationalism which says the world is now knowable. It's still, if it's saying what I'm rejecting is being told what to believe here, it still leaves open this possibility that there is an unknowability in society. But
it's a good segue. So I relate with your research as well. I find the question of the conspiratorial subject very interesting because it kind of denotes UFO culture is usually associated with counterculture in the US. And I think it's likewise people who distance themselves from governmental and religious authority only to try to put the pieces together themselves. So usually following a conspiracy theory or like formulating a conspiracy theory is like a practice of connecting the dots in a way. And then I think that's what we're trying to figure out with unbelievers as well on both occasions. So once you make that swift dismissal of normative understandings of religion, where do you go from there? And it's usually people kind of plunging into that gray area of religious beliefs and social norms and kind of devising their own worldviews and perspectives.
Which I think in a way brings us full circle, because if your starting point in talking about modernity, and is that in essence, as individuals, there's so much that we don't know. We might assume that somebody else knows it, or we hope that somebody knows how to make planes work, or we hope that there's somebody who understands all these things. But on an individual level, it's left to us to piece those things together and to try and work out what those chains of causality are.
Yeah.
And
I think there's like a greater point to be made about, ontological point to be made about unknowability, about the unknowability of relations. Like social relations can never be complete. Like our understanding of the world can never be complete. And I think there's 2 or 3 ethnographies I read on witchcraft that they start. The ethnographer says, "I've never seen a witch." There's on the first page. I think Father Sada does it, or Niels Bubent, is that his surname? I don't know. On the Empty Seashore, like that's the starting line. I've never seen a witch. The locals have never seen a witch, but nevertheless, because of this, people's awareness of their fragmented understanding of the world, they can't entertain that possibility of the witch.
And I think that's a core thing, and one of our theoretical influence in a way in Evans Pritchard's classic study of witchcraft, in which he debunks the idea that may have been common at the time. These are people with a primitive mindset who don't understand the rules of cause and effect. He says, no, they think through exactly the same mindset as us. If somebody dies while sleeping under the granary, and you ask why that is, and you ask, well, the explanation is witchcraft, but that doesn't mean that they dismiss the fact that termites ate through the legs and that's why the granary fell down. There's a question of, but why did termites eat through the legs of the granary at that point when that person was sleeping under? What? And he says, now, this is the same logic that we operate on. It's just that we dismiss why questions as legitimate questions. So we have all kinds of means of explaining these how questions, of explaining physical causality. But the problem of the why, which is generally dismissed as a legitimate question to ask, but it remains as a problem, and it remains a problem that people grapple with in their everyday lives, and they do so in ways that I think sometimes can be referred to as magical.
Mm-hmm. It does bring us full circle, and we are not immune from answering why questions here at the Religious Studies Project. And the why of how we have to stop now is that we've run out of time. I want to thank you both for taking part, and hopefully we can have you back on another day to continue the conversation.
Sure.
Hope so.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, David. It's fantastic to hear some research that's happening within that broader project. Do check out the interview from a few weeks ago that I did with Lois Lee, and it's great to hear of the comparative aspect being done there, because our central categories sometimes take on quite different forms in different contexts. And I'm talking about comparative and collaborative research. The BASR, who are one of our headline sponsors, are having a joint conference this year with the Irish Society for the Academic Study of Religions, and we're having this conference from the 3rd to the 5th of September at Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland being that ambiguous sort of quote shared unquote territory of the British and Irish associations. This is the first formal collaboration between these two societies, although we've been working quite closely together for a number of years. In fact, Brian Bocking, who was at the University College Cork, was a former president of the BASR, and he was quite instrumental in setting up the Irish Society, and indeed their constitution is modelled on the British Association's constitution.
Have we ever interviewed Brian Bocking?
We have not.
No, we've interviewed James Capello
who's the current president,
and Jenny Butler,
who's the secretary. And Owen O'Mahony has served on their board as well. The conference themes on its borders and boundaries, religion on the periphery, and we've got Gladys Gagnon of Queen's University Belfast, giving one of the keynote lectures. She's been on the RSP before, speaking about the emerging church movement, and also Naomi Goldenberg of the University of Ottawa. She was on the RSP, one of our very first interviews, speaking about religion as vestigial states. So that call for papers is open until the end of April. We would love to see you there, and we will, of course, be covering the conference.
Yes, we will, and I would fully expect an interview with Naomi Goldenberg. Tried to make that work when we were in Bonn last year, but
we're having too much fun.
Yeah, we were just too busy. But we'll also be recording our Christmas special there again. And then we're thinking that'll be the last one at BASR for a year or two, and then we're going to go for EASR the following year and IHR in 2020.
Fantastic.
If we're still going.
We'll still be going. It'll be great. So that's a few months ahead in the future, but do come back next week to hear an interview that I recorded at the beginning of January with Tim Stacey on his book that's just recently been published. The interview is called Myth, Solidarity and Post-Liberalism, but we'll tell you a bit more about that next week.
Very intriguing. However, this week, the only other thing we've got to say is...
thanks for listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our opportunities digest by Yana Shirley. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio assistance from Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget, you can support the project using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or by donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals.